Okay, we are recording. And so the course page documents, which so again, if you access that reading, which, sorry, my computer's running really slow. Okay, so please note that I am posting the recordings each day if you are not here for whatever reason. I would like for you to be here for the live sessions. That's obviously important. But yesterday you had a reading to do that was posted right here. And we're going to go over that just briefly. Can everybody hear me okay? If you can't hear me, just let me know. I'm trying to speak up a little bit because, like I said, I have the air conditioner thing going on in the background. So, okay, so the purpose of this reading that we looked at yesterday was that it discusses the fact that the characteristics of each region are unique in a way that requires us and historians and geographers to label the colonies by region rather than just identifying them as 13 colonies or just, you know, being so specific you talk about names. We're not going to get to the point where we dive any deeper with this and other than talking about religious groups and economic differences. There's no reason for me, in my opinion, that we worry about dates or specific people that founded the colonies. The colonies were founded for diverse reasons that have to do with money or religion or both. But other than that, you know, these colonies are really about making money for England. That's the whole point of that, okay? And so when you look at the way that these colonies are reviewed, religion really is the big dominant discussion that we see in the New England colonies because we have Pilgrims and Puritans that are shaping their interpretation of religion away from the Church of England, okay? And to kind of give you a very basic understanding of what goes on in England is that depending on who is the monarch, you have this back and forth switch between a Catholic leader and a Protestant leader. And Catholicism and Protestant fighting and rivalry in religion has been going on for centuries, but even before this. And so if you have a situation where you have a Catholic leader and you have groups like the Pilgrims and the Puritans that are more Protestant that want things to be viewed and interpreted in a different way in terms of religion, that's when they begin to question that. And that especially with the Puritans. The Pilgrims are separatists. These were more about separating or breaking away from the church. The Puritans were about purifying it or reforming it. Okay, and they end up settling in the same area in and around Massachusetts, but it's really breaking down the idea that these two groups cannot see themselves living in England because they're going to be persecuted, they're being threatened, and their idea is that they have their interpretation of religion that they're going to go to the colonies with. And they're going to be able to use that as a way of shaping society. And, you know, this key here, right here, where it says to reshape society to match what they believe God wanted, that's just in their interpretation of religion. So they're going to focus on the development of the colonies to be based on shaping society, the way you live, the way you worship, the way you grow crops, the way you work, to all be based on that, okay? And so that's why religion is such a big thing in that region. Now, when you go to the middle colonies are more shaped on the fact that you have diversity living there. Diversity in terms of religious groups and diversity based on ethnic background and country of origin. I mean, if you look here and you see the people that are living there in that region, in addition to the, you know, the fact that they're interacting with the Algonquin and the Iroquois tribes, that brings together a much more diverse, interconnected group. Now, it is important to know that even though we have groups in the middle colonies like the Quakers, who were accepting of all these people, who wanted to be able to have different religious backgrounds living in the same region. And it's all based on this idea that, you know, what William Penn described as this holy experiment. It's not going to be, you know, it's not going to be that kind of perfect utopia. Like, for example, one of the things that happens over time between Native Americans and even Quakers, who are more accepting of Native Americans, is that Quakers begin to push, you know, the perspective of assimilation on Native Americans. Does anybody remember what assimilation means? We talked about it a while back. Feel free to share if you know.
Like forcing other people to join your group, or like religion or whatever?
Yeah, it can be forced, it can be more encouraged, but basically you are asking a group of people to adopt your principles, your customs, the way you live, and your religion. So yeah, it's something that European settlers had been doing for years and years and years, starting with the Spanish in the Western Hemisphere, as the interactions with Native Americans became more hostile. One of the things that Europeans expected out of the natives was a conversion to Christianity. And in most cases, Native Americans were resistant of that because they obviously had their own culture, their own beliefs, their own cultural beliefs, spiritual beliefs, etc. And so even a group like the Quakers, which are definitely a revolutionary advanced group in the way they see equality, and the fact that they were outspoken against slavery, and many people who were Quakers went on to be abolitionists, it doesn't mean that they were squeaky clean, because there were situations, especially interacting with natives, where that became a concern about pushing assimilation, okay? When you get to the Southern colonies, okay, we obviously know that agriculture drives everything about the Southern colonies. And because the Southern colonies insist on needing a reliable workforce, because more crops are being grown, there's more demand for a labor force. And when we know that relying on indigenous people as workers or indentured servants cannot meet that demand, that's when the slave labor really becomes the main source of labor in the colonies. And that's why, again, over time, you know, if you look at everything to the north of Maryland, you know, it references, if you're talking about a map, to the north of Maryland, they're not going to be understanding the reason why there's such a demand for slave labor. It doesn't mean that every colony doesn't have slavery be legal. It's legal everywhere. Puritans had slaves in Massachusetts, which would be a place that wouldn't make sense to have slave labor. I mean, obviously, nobody wants to condone slave labor in any regard. But the point here is that if you lived in the middle or New England colonies, your viewpoint about slavery was much different, because you didn't understand the pressing need for it like Southerners would. And again, when we talk about the long-term development of economies, the middle and New England region are going to develop more technology, while the Southern colonies will keep on this main pace with agriculture because it serves the needs of their economy. There's always going to be a cash crop. You know, tobacco, right here, tobacco is going to be the most desirable cash crop for a very long time, but eventually that demand is going to level off. And then when cotton is produced, and cotton is a desirable crop to use to make clothing, so nobody has to wear everything like wool when it's 90 degrees outside, then cotton becomes in demand. And it can be grown in the Southern colonies where it has that hot, humid, like tropical climate. And so that's why, in many ways, the demand for slave labor will kind of re-energize and go all the way through to 1865, when it's finally eliminated by the 13th Amendment. Okay, so the big idea here is to understand that we have 13 English colonies, but those 13 English colonies are a diversity. There's a great amount of diversity in terms of the types of people living there, the types of economies they have, and the types of religions that we have. Okay, does anybody have any questions about that? So if we focus back on the Puritans, which were a group that had a very strict code of ethics in terms of the way you lived, the way you dressed, the way you grew crops, the way you worked, the way you worshiped. It's interesting to see what unravels with Puritan society and what in many ways brought the success of the colony in Massachusetts under Puritan leadership to a decline, okay? And what I'm talking about here is the Salem witch trials. And witchcraft is something that had been a concern of religious groups for centuries. This is not a new phenomenon with the Puritans, okay? And so what happens is there is going to be an outbreak of accusations and paranoia that are going to ensue in the colony or in the community of Salem, which is a small coastal town to the north of Boston. And what is going to happen is in the early 1690s, you're going to begin to have people exhibiting behaviors that cannot be explained. You're going to have individuals begin to have convulsions and hallucinations and stomach pains and fever. And what's going to happen is it's going to lead to a situation where we have individuals being accused of practicing witchcraft. And what that's going to do is it's going to create a massive amount of paranoia in a community that is driven largely by religion. All right, so we're going to watch. Yeah, go ahead.
Did they ever actually figure out what was actually going on with all the
Sure. We're going to talk about some of the theories that could explain the occurrences of that. Absolutely, yes. I'm going to play this. I activated the audio, but let's make sure it works here. So if you're not hearing it, please let me know.
You've been accused of a crime you did not commit. It's impossible to prove your innocence. If you insist that you're innocent anyway, you'll likely be found guilty and executed. But if you confess, apologize, and implicate others for good measure, you'll go free. Do you give a false confession or risk a public hanging? This was the choice facing those accused of witchcraft in the village of Salem, Massachusetts, between February 1692 and May 1693.
Okay, so what we have here is this is the time period of the trials. The accusations are going to occur before this, but what's going to happen is there's going to be a special court set up primarily to deal with the accusations that are occurring in the community.
They were the victims of paranoia about the supernatural, misdirected religious fervor, and a justice system that valued repentance over truth. Salem was settled in 1626 by Puritans, a group of English Protestants. Life was strict and isolated for the people of Salem. Battles with their Native American neighbors and groups of French settlers were commonplace. People feared starvation and disease, and relations between villagers were strained. To make matters worse, 1692 brought one of the coldest winters on record. That winter, two cousins, 9-year-old Betty Paris and 11-year-old Abigail Williams, started behaving very strangely. A physician found nothing physically wrong, but diagnosed the girls as under an evil hand.
And this was the problem. If physicians at the time could not diagnose the problem, and it was something unique like this that was out of the ordinary, they brought in being possessed or under the influence of witchcraft. And as soon as that happens, it's going to drive a massive hysteria of concern in a community that, again, where religion is so much a part of their everyday lives.
Puritans believed that the devil wreaked havoc in the world through human agents, or witches, who blighted nature, conjured fiendish apparitions, and tormented children. As news swept through the village, the symptoms appeared to spread. Accounts described 12 so-called afflicted girls contorting their bodies, having fits, and complaining of prickling skin. 4 of the girls soon accused 3 local women of tormenting them. All three of the accused were considered outsiders in some way. On February 29th, the authorities arrested Sarah Good, a poor pregnant mother of a young daughter, Sarah Osborne, who had long been absent from church and was suing the family of one of her accusers, and Tituba, an enslaved woman in Betty Paris's home known by her first name only. Tituba denied harming the girls at first, but then she confessed to practicing witchcraft on the devil's orders and charged Good and Osborne with having forced her. Osborne and Good both maintained their innocence. Osborne died in prison, while Good's husband turned against her in court, testifying that she was a witch or would be one very quickly. Good's 4-year-old daughter was imprisoned and eventually gave testimony against her mother. Meanwhile, Good gave birth in jail. Her baby died, and she was convicted and hanged shortly thereafter. Tituba was held in custody until May and then released. These 3 victims were just the beginning. As accusations multiplied, others, like Tituba, made false confession to save themselves. The authorities even reportedly told one accused witch that she would be hanged if she did not confess and freed if she did. They were not particularly interested in thoroughly investigating the charges. In keeping with their church's teachings, they preferred that the accused confessed, asked for forgiveness, and promised not to engage in more witchcraft. The court accepted all kinds of dubious evidence, including so-called spectral evidence.
This is what ultimately doomed the effectiveness of the court to actually be accurate, is that they basically allowed people to claim that they had visions or had a dream about something or someone being a witch, and that was brought in as evidence and was accepted. And early on, there wasn't a lot of pushback about it, but that was ultimately the beginning of it, the end for these trials, is because the accusations were being put on people that were upstanding citizens in the community and people that would have had, it would have been extremely shocking to have them be someone who was tied with the witch trials.
In which the girls began raving when supposedly touched by invisible ghosts. Complicating matters further, many of the jurors in the trials were relatives of the accusers, compromising their objectivity. Those who dared to speak out, such as Judge Nathaniel Saltonstall, came under suspicion. By the spring of 1693, over 100 people had been imprisoned, and 14 women and 6 men had been executed. By this time, accusations were starting to spread beyond Salem to neighboring communities, and even the most powerful figures were targets. When his own wife was accused, the governor of Massachusetts colony suspended the trials. Sentences were amended, prisoners released, and arrests stopped. Some have speculated that the girls were suffering from hallucinations caused by fungus, or a condition that caused swelling of the brain. But
okay, so you're asking about the explanation. Scientifically, the most plausible explanation is that the girls had been eating grain, which was grown in Massachusetts, that was tainted with a fungus called ergot, E-R-G-O-T. And ergot can cause hallucinations, muscle spasms, stomach problems, headaches, fatigue, could also cause fever, all things that these girls were exhibiting. And so it's one of the more plausible explanations for what happened, because so much of what happened after the initial confrontation was largely, just people were acting out and convulsively, like there were claims that girls who were accusing people of being witches would start having convulsions when someone walked in the door in court, and that was used as evidence. So it really became just way out of control. But the being affected by the fungus seems to have the most validity in terms of being a correct reasoning for what happened.
ultimately, the reason for their behavior is unknown. What we do know is that adults accepted wild accusations by children as hard evidence. Today, the Salem witch trials remain a cautionary tale, of the dangers of groupthink and scapegoating, and the power of fear to manipulate human perception.
And it's interesting because there's a lot of correlation between what we see with the Salem witch trials and what happens in the United States during the period of communists rising after World War II and the fear of communism. Because there's going to be scenarios where paranoia is going to be set in based on accusations made there. It doesn't result in people being executed, but it does bring into account concerns that people have about whether or not people are being honest or truthful about it. So I'm going to go back to the course page to let you know about what you're going to be doing tomorrow. This is a really interesting assignment tomorrow. It's one of the ones I really like to do. So let me pull up. Okay, so if we're here tomorrow, Friday, September 11th, we're on our online period. We'll meet briefly to kind of discuss the assignment, but I want to make sure you see that. So when you open it up, and I'm going to re-share my window in case you can't see it. All right, so what you have here is a document that's going to give you more details about the background of the witch trials. And this image kind of brings to light some of these wild accusations that people made in these courts. And then you're going to go and you're going to have 4 short documents that you're going to look at. So evidence A, a statement about witchcraft. Evidence B, testimony by Abigail Hobbs, who was accused. Document C, which is a chart that represents the size of farms in Salem. And then evidence D, this is one I find most interesting, which is a map that's going to describe more or less where people lived in terms of if they were an accuser, someone pointing the finger and saying somebody else was a witch, or D, a person who was defending themselves against the accusation. And there's a lot to that in terms of the breakdown between the 2 parts of Salem town and Salem village. Okay, so it's important that you read that and look at the map carefully. And then you're going to look at and describe each piece of evidence and then use the piece of evidence to answer this question for each document, A, B, C, and D. And then the last thing you're going to do, and we'll talk about this more briefly tomorrow when we meet, is you're going to use all 4 pieces of evidence to write a paragraph to explain what causes Salem witch trials, okay? So as we kind of wrap things up here, tomorrow we are still meeting. We meet at 12 o'clock to 12:35. You can go ahead and start on the assignment tomorrow. We're going to meet tomorrow to kind of answer any questions that you may have about it and talk a little bit more. I have a couple other clips that I want to show you that are parodies of the Salem witch trials in terms of pop in like modern times, the way it's kind of been portrayed, which is interesting. And we'll go from there. Okay. Does anybody have any questions before we adjourn? All right.